on, isn't it? So, can people hear me at the back okay? Yeah, good. So, welcome to our 11th annual Phil Richardson Memorial Lecture. I'm Jeremy Clark, I'm the newly elected chair of the APP, and I've also been organising these lectures for the past 11 years. One of the handouts that hopefully some of you have got give you a list of the 10 years, last 10 years prior to this one, of the lectures, which have been mostly focused on research presentations. Phil Richardson was probably the principal driver behind the Tavistock adult depression study and the first randomised controlled trial of long-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy in this country, but sadly passed away some years ago, and the baton was handed on then to Peter Fonigan and David Taylor. Felicitas Rost has been involved in that research more recently. And the findings, very rich findings from that trial, are continuing to inform us about both how effective long-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy can be for particular groups of patients, why it's effective, and hopefully at some stage cost-effective analyses. So we hope there's a rich database there that we continue to draw on. However, this evening's lecture or event is a different format. Partly it marks a changing of the guard at the APP as I step into the role of being chair, and partly it marks a need to take stock, as it were, of where the direction of the field is going, where psychoanalytic psychotherapy fits in to the field. And I just want to say a couple of remarks about the importance of that before we hear from our speakers on the subject. I think the first thing to say is that the hope when the Tavistock started that trial was that we would then have a means of ensuring we had a place within NICE guidelines. It was quite clear some 20 years ago probably, but certainly evident by the time 10 years ago, that therapies that were not subjected to trials to demonstrate efficacy, that could therefore claim a place within a NICE guideline, would not feature significantly in future NHS service designs and service models. But really the way in which NICE is trying to roll out evidence-based practice is increasingly shaping what gets delivered to patients and increasingly shaping the priorities of clinicians for what it is they're prepared to invest in. And so the Tavistock adult study, one of its motivations was to ensure a place for psychoanalytic psychotherapy in that paradigm, that policy or framework within the NHS. The depression guideline, which is what that randomised controlled trial is aimed at, has been now in gestation, the current version, since I think 2015. And at an earlier stage, at its first draft stage, had dropped psychodynamic psychotherapy altogether. Which indicates that even when you've done a high-quality randomised controlled trial, that is not a guarantee that you're going to be able to claim a place within NICE recommendations. And therefore, we need to think about, well, that's necessary. That's definitely a necessary component of what we need to be doing, but it's not sufficient. There are other things that we're going to need to be doing as well, including a great deal of political work, I think, both in terms of the science side of things, trying to challenge some of the sort of rather arbitrary hierarchies of evidence that are used by NICE, differently than some of the other what works centres that the government looks to, but also just direct political lobbying to the likes of Northern Land, to the likes of the Health Select Committee, to challenge and hold to account NICE for the objectivity and the transparency of the way in which they are arriving at their guideline recommendations. So that I think is one of the themes, going to be one of the themes for this evening's discussion. I also wanted to just refer, and perhaps have a little bit of audience participation at the start to give our speakers a sense of where you think the field is at the moment. So we've titled this evening's talk a 10-year plan for psychoanalytic psychotherapy in the NHS. Obviously there is the long-term plan that NHS England have produced that provides the strategic framework within which the NHS is moving over the next 10 years. It doesn't mention psychoanalytic psychotherapy. It barely mentions psychotherapy. In fact, it doesn't mention the term psychotherapy at all. The only mention within the long-term plan is for IAPT and for talking therapies within IAPT. And then there are various commitments within other mental health services, perinatal mental health services that clearly are going to feature talking therapies or psychotherapy, but there aren't any explicit commitments around psychotherapy per se. So that's also one of the challenges within the long-term plan. But we thought about, well, what would we need to have in terms of a long-term plan for our discipline, for our sector. And we tried a version of this, in fact, about 10 years ago. A group of us, and actually the Tavistock, the BPC, the Anna Freud Centre, the APP, came together as a working group to try to collaborate on a piece of work that dynamic interpersonal therapy was the main output for. But it also came together, and one of the offshoots of that was the very successful Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Now conferences. And it had a broader agenda, really, of trying to bring organisations into a working relationship so that there were different forms of collaboration. And as part of that, at the first Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Now conference, Malcolm Allen, who was then the chief executive of the BPC, set out a sort of SWOT analysis, if you like, of our field, and talked about what he felt were some of the key components of renewal that would be needed. And I just want to briefly then just tell you what he said those key components were. This is 10 years ago. And then I want to ask you the question, which I'll ask for a show of hands on. So there are three questions. Have we made good progress overall on these components for renewal? Have we made some progress overall on these components for renewal? Or in your opinion, have we made little to no progress? I won't ask if we've gone backwards, but the people who feel we have gone backwards in some respects can indicate that we've made little to no progress. So I'm going to ask three questions in a show of hands for an overall sort of, as it were, temperature take. And our speakers can then kind of see who they're talking to and what the challenge is then ahead. So he mentioned 8 components. A reaffirmation of the scientific basis for our work, and a re-engagement with the wider family of the modern sciences of the mind, a rekindling of the passion for social justice within our movement, openness to innovation and research, an engagement with social policy and the public health and social care sector, rethinking and reconfiguring our training to be fit for the 21st century, a more direct engagement with the public at large and attuning ourselves to contemporary demography, building a network and infrastructure in the nations and the regions, and building organisation and leadership. So taking all 8 components together, what do you think? So let's start with the optimistic people. Who thinks that we've made good progress in those 8 components? Okay. So, and this is where the people who always sit on the fence are going to stick their hands up. Who thinks we've made some progress? Yeah, that's okay. So that's clearly the vast majority. And who thinks, like me, we've made little to no progress on those components? Yeah. Okay. Well, the other ones are definitely right. So clearly there is work to do. And this evening's discussion, I think, is going to be an interesting part of starting that work and starting a discussion about how we will approach that work. And I hope that one of the outcomes then is going to give the APP and myself a sense of sort of some of the priorities and some of the direction of travel that we need to try to take things in. And during my term of office then I shall be working to try and develop the kinds of partnerships and collaborations that will deliver some of the kind of priorities that people are thinking or some of the urgent issues that people are thinking we need to start to address in 10 years' time. We're going to be able to have a show of hands that is mostly saying we've made good progress on the renewal agenda. So, given that we've got a couple of PowerPoint presentations, I think we should start with those, and I'm going to come down and look at those. So I'd like to introduce then as our first speaker, Isabel Pick, who is the chair of the Association of Child Psychotherapists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I go here, do I?
Yeah, and there's a clicker there. Oh, you can just use that, yeah.
Okay. So I think I've got up to 10 minutes, and I think I've got about 8 slides, so I'm going to whiz through them a bit quickly, but we can come back to anything that you want to come back to. Can I just ask how many people here work with children and young people rather than adults? Okay, so there's a few. A minority though, let's say. I'm here representing the Association of Child Psychotherapists, and we're perhaps unusual in the NHS because we're an NHS core profession and we are psychoanalytically trained to work with children, young people and families. So we're in perhaps a slightly unusual position compared to some other professions. But we're in a battle within the NHS to maintain that position. So I want to describe a little bit about what we're doing to fight our battle, and how I actually want to endorse a lot of what you've just said about we need to work together and we need to be political. So just starting with the situation of children's mental health services in general, I think everyone here will have seen a lot of coverage in the press about the very poor state of children's mental health services in this country. Last year there was new data from NHS Digital showing a rise in the prevalence of mental disorders in children and young people. And even before that, the mental health services were known to be only meeting 25% of the need with very limited resources. In fact, 6% it was, now it's 9% of the mental health budget was being spent on children and young people, and that's 6% or 9% of 6%, which is spent on mental health out of the overall NHS budget. So it's a tiny amount of money for a huge problem. And I suppose the things that were reaching the newspapers, and if, in a way this was became a political issue, and it brought mental health services up the agenda, the extent to which children and young people were harming themselves, referring themselves to A&E, dropping out of education, getting caught in the youth justice system, and continuing to suffer into adulthood. So the OTP a year ago launched a campaign which we called Treat Them Right. And it was a campaign really in relation to specialist services, particularly within children's mental health services, because our members mainly work in specialist services. But the campaign very much started with how the needs of young people were not being met. And in the face of this tremendous demand that wasn't being met, we very much sort of wanted to be saying, in a way, you need specialist services, but you also need the increase in the workforce delivering treatments for mild to moderate conditions as well. So I'm summarising that as both and. We weren't saying, let's not have IAPT, or let's not have the green paper proposals. We were saying that let's have that, but let's keep the specialist services and improve them as well. You can't do one without the other, actually. We did some case studies of what was going on in some local CAM services. We did a survey of our members. We got tremendous response. 2/3 of the members working in NHS clinics responded to the survey. And actually the combination of those two things we feel was quite a powerful message, and it got quite a lot of attention in the press. It enabled us to identify a list of what we call the danger signs of CAMs in trouble, and they're summarised in a report which we entitled Silent Catastrophe, which is a quote from one of our members who used that term to describe what was going on in his clinic. Silent because nobody can see until young people end up in A&E that, you know, services, essential services, are being dismantled. So, in a sense, all the attention that got in recent years has had some impact, because the long-term plan does indicate that mental health funding should grow faster than the NHS budget as a whole, and children's mental health should grow faster than mental health as a whole. The long-term plan includes this extremely ambitious target of 345,000 children, additional children and young people, will be able to access mental health services. But those will mainly be through the proposals that were outlined in the Green Paper in 2017. So they're mental health teams in schools, really, mainly helping kids with mild to moderate difficulties. There's lots of questions about how they're going to be integrated into specialist services or not, as the case may be. But it's a very ambitious target. Even with that target, it only covers 1/3 of the country by 2023, so it's still a step on the road, if you like. But the long-term plan does also include a goal that in the coming decade, 100% of children and young people who need specialist care can access it. And that's a very interesting statement, because how on earth is that going to happen? Anyway, we'll see how that transpires. But it gives us a lever, in a way, to talk to politicians and people in NHS England. So there are priority services within the long-term plan for children and young people's mental health services. Perhaps I don't need to run through all of those. We can come back to them if you like. One thing that's of interest to us is that there's the thing down the bottom there, entirely new idea of services for children who have complex needs that are not currently being met, which would be a new area for specialist services, particularly focusing on children who've been victims of crime, such as abuse. So there are lots of challenges for the implementation of this plan, and everybody says, including the policy people trying to put things in place to make it work, that workforce is the big issue. Training up enough people for these new roles in schools, huge numbers of them, and the promise is that the creation of these new teams in schools isn't going to sort of suck staff and expertise out of specialist services, that they're aware that that's a risk, and they promise that if it happens there'll be backfill. But actually, we're saying, along with many other people, you need to watch out for making sure that you've got enough skilled and experienced staff to provide the training, supervision, and case consultation and leadership that these new roles will need, but that specialist services need as well. And we are also emphasising the need for clinical leadership, because staff morale and retention are as big problems actually as recruitment in the workforce planning. And our main concern, I suppose, is how the NHS is going to ensure that high quality and specialist needs are met when, high quality and specialist services, that should say, are in place when there's so much focus on the targets, and there's ring-fence funding as well for these new roles and new teams in schools, and also the trialling of a 4-week waiting time, which we fear might have quite adverse consequences. So where do we fit as a profession? We feel we fit in both community and specialist services. We are clinicians that offer training, supervision, case consultation and leadership. We have experience, for example, in schools that's relevant to this agenda. We treat the most ill and the most ill children who need specialist and multidisciplinary team treatment. As I mentioned, there are these new services for children with very complex needs. An interesting area is that the 18 to 25-year-old age group is going to be covered in a new way through the sort of knitting together of children's services and adult services, and I think that could be an interesting area for us to discuss, actually, how adult practitioners and children practitioners can work together. And at the moment, really, there's no meaningful targets, we don't think, or KPIs relating to quality and to the provision of specialist care and treatment, and to service user experience. So I think that's an area that we could collaborate on. And these are all things that are, people in NHS England need help thinking about, I think. So you mentioned NICE. There are 2 NICE standards that include psychoanalytic psychotherapy for children and young people. And we've been looking at Thrive, which is mentioned in the long-term plan as a model that Tavistock uses, and seeing where we can fit into that kind of model of service design. So these are my sort of thoughts really about how we can, as a psychoanalytic community, contribute to these developments. I would completely echo Malcolm Allen's thoughts that we need to see ourselves as part of a whole system that includes health, social care and education. We need to work with our disciplines within health and beyond health to think about practice and policy. We need to understand that from the point of view of politicians and policymakers in the NHS, what they are experiencing is what I've heard several times described as a tsunami of demand or need, and that's the agenda that is driving these developments. And we can't just sort of say, well, that's irrelevant. You know, what about us doing a specialist work? What about the small number of children that need specialist help? We have to see where we can fit in and help with that agenda, and we also have to make sure they don't overlook the needs of the small group of children who do need specialist help. We've very much learned that we're too small to do this on our own. We link up with psychiatrists, we link up with psychologists, and we link up with other organisations in the psychoanalytic world, and we'd like to do that more. Many of you may have heard of the Psychological Professions Network, PPN. It seems to us that that's an opportunity for us to work together within our community, but also to link up with other psychological professions. And they seem to be increasingly influential with HEE and the NHS in terms of workforce planning. So I think we need to be in there. And I think the last thing I'd like to say is that I think we need to have things to say about prevention and early intervention, because this tsunami is being created by something. And it's not just ACEs and you know, the things that we think about as mental health professionals. I kind of feel like we need to have a voice about social conditions, you know, that are creating these problems for children and families. Housing, unemployment, inequality, climate change maybe. You can see what a difference it makes when young people get up and do something that makes people feel hopeful, you know, that things could change. So, yeah, I'd quite like to collaborate on that as well. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and I hope we'll pick up some of these opportunities and challenges in the discussion. The latest report of the figures from the National Suicide Statistics have highlighted that it's actually young people who we have a rising suicide rate in. All the rest of the age groups have just recently started to come down after having been rising during austerity. But young people are actually going in the opposite direction, and rather alarmingly so. Social conditions must clearly be something to do with that. But of course, the challenge that perhaps I should make explicit for the Association of Child Psychotherapists for the 10-year plan is still to be here in 10 years. The threat to child psychotherapy training, along with clinical psychology training, has been raised as an issue for decision by Health Education England, and that's going to take a campaign group, certainly with the psychologists and the child psychotherapists in alliance, but with a wider group of people, also trying to challenge that threat and combat that threat, and certainly make clear that there will be a huge fuss made if they follow through on that threat. So I might come back to yourself and Nick to ask where we are on that in the discussion. So it's my pleasure now to introduce a second chair, someone who I have worked with in hand-to-hand combat in the trenches with IAPT, in her role then as the Chief Executive of Tavistock Relationships, but I'm introducing her this evening in her role as the Chair of the British Psychoanalytic Council. Susan Outson.
Yes, there was, I think, some of the most unpleasant meetings I've ever been to have been with Jeremy. But it wasn't Jeremy that was particularly unpleasant. And the people who are unpleasant shall remain nameless. But it was a lesson, some of those meetings which were about choice in therapy provision in IAPT. It was a lesson in how powerful some of the forces are that are aligned actually against the development of anything. It's on the should be on the desktop. You put it on the desktop. So if I click that down, there.
Oh, good.
Okay. I can do it.
Great. Well done.
So yeah, I'm very pleased that he asked me to talk because as chair of the British Psychoanalytic Council, the future of psychodynamic therapy in the health service is going to be absolutely key to the long-term development of psychoanalytic psychodynamic practice in the UK. I've never worked in the NHS, though I have worked closely with Health Education England Department of Health, and that's because I'm a couple psychoanalytic psychotherapist and there simply isn't any place for psychoanalytic couple work within the NHS. I think my perspective will have less to say about what's happening in the health service, because that isn't my area of expertise, and more on how things are in our profession. There are many things at play in the loss of ground that has happened in the psychoanalytic world, but my thoughts are going to be about what our own contribution has been to this demise and what we must do to turn it around. And of course, actually, you probably could just read the piece that Jeremy read out, and I could just sit down, but nevertheless, I'm going to talk a bit about it and hopefully provide a way forward and some particular things that we have to do. This is one of my favourite psychoanalysis in the doldrums PowerPoint slides, because it's about how many people actually looked for psychoanalysis in Google Books over a period of time. You can see the decline. I have, however, had a brief look again at the long-term plan and the most recent report on the mental health workforce, which I know is now under consideration again. From the 2017 report, it's clear that there's going to be a big expansion of psychological therapy, psychological workforce, but what part our profession will take is completely uncertain, as people have said. But I know that psychodynamic therapies are needed. Our paradigm has much to offer, and if it's lost to the health service, that will be an enormous loss to both those seeking help and actually to ourselves, because our engagement in the health service has been one of the ways our profession has developed all sorts of capacities and resources. Private practice does not teach you, for instance, how to lead and manage. It doesn't really help you engage in research. So we really need our profession to be engaged in the workforce for our needs as well as for patients' needs. In 2001, Robert Bornstein wrote a paper called The Impending Death of Psychoanalysis, and since then many analysts have tried to understand how the profession has got itself in its current parlous state. This book, which is the most recent book I think, which was published last year, Progress in Psychoanalysis, is really worth the read. It's an American book, but it says lots of interesting things. I'm going to quote from Bornstein. He says, "Psychoanalysis remains a paradox, one of the 20th century's great intellectual achievements, and at the same time one of its most resounding scientific failures. The failure, though, has less to do with the theory itself than with how psychoanalysts have mismanaged the project." He goes on to say that if psychoanalysis were merely a theoretical model or a method of gaining insight and self-awareness, many of the criticisms levelled at it would be unjustified. However, psychodynamic and psychoanalytic treatment is a technique for treating psychological disorders, and this aspect has raised practical and ethical challenges that we haven't met. In the paper, he outlines what he calls the 7 deadly sins of psychoanalysis. For this talk, I've written my own 7 deadly sins and then tried to outline 7 lively virtues that we need to adopt if we are to ensure a future. They're pretty similar to Malcolm's. So the first one is insularity and problems with integration. We are a profession that tend not to talk to anyone but ourselves. Now, of course, if you're working in a multidisciplinary team in the health service, that isn't true. But there's an awful lot of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic professionals who only really talk to each other, who are not engaged with other theoretical and scientific developments. Even when they empirically contradict our own theories, we ignore them. And by doing so, we deprive ourselves of exposure to competing viewpoints and alternative perspectives that I think would enrich the psychoanalytic model. Consequently, the maturation of our theoretical propositions has been retarded and the refinement of our techniques slow. So we actually have to do more on that. We also haven't been good at listening to others, but we haven't really been very good at talking to others either. Our comms has been naive, and until recently nearly all our societies have assumed modern ways of marketing ourselves. Even within our profession we tend to stay in our own little groups or societies, and that is a really serious problem in terms of actually how we promote our profession and how we work with policymakers. Second is accountability, and we don't like to be accountable to other people. We've avoided joining in. You know, right at the beginning of the health service, we had an opportunity to become a core profession, psychoanalysis, and we turned it down. Isn't that an extraordinary mistake? We found it hard to engage with research, and we came very late to the table on this, leading to an impression that we were uninterested in our outcomes and are both arrogant and defensive. While we need research to prove our worth, we also seem to have a mindset which is, we need to develop a mindset rather, which is about being curious about what we achieve and open to finding out something new, even if it means changing what we do. A lot of this is because we can be very individualistic and equivocal about authority, experiencing it often as authoritarian, which leads to the third deadly sin, the problem with authority and leadership. We have a great problem with empowering leaders, and I would say that, wouldn't I? The old trope about herding cats is true. We don't like to fit in with organisational structures, we often ignore rules and directives, we're dismissive of administrative requirements. There can be a contempt for professional activity outside the sphere of the consulting room. Really being a leader can be seen as something essentially a non-intellectual activity involving boring bureaucratic procedures that feel that they interfere or attack the real work of training or clinical work. Who then really wants to be a leader in that situation? The fourth, or it might be on fifth, I can't remember, is rumination. Some of the difficulty with leadership links to the idea derived from Bion that the therapist must cultivate a not knowing state of mind in order to be really with the patient, rather than with a set of pre-learnt theories or ideas, as in the case of other more technocratic therapies. Bion suggests that the therapist needs to be patient and borrows from the poet Keats the idea of negative capability to describe a state of mind of continuous uncertainty rather than jumping to conclusions, decisions and action. Obviously, this being rather than doing approach can be rather at odds with the requirements of leadership, where timely decision making and activity is necessary. And sometimes acting is confused in our profession with acting out. I also think that we like to think about things a lot, but we think about them too long, and sometimes we get very deadly and stuck. We're fearful of making mistakes. We need reflective institutions and practitioners, but we don't need rumination. I think this problem is also linked to how insecure the profession is. And to my mind, this insecurity is in part to do with our insularity. We simply don't get out enough. And so we end up anxious about decision making and the change it brings. The fifth is ancestor worship. We overvalue our heritage almost to the point of fetishism. We have much to acknowledge and be proud of, but we need to constantly encourage and celebrate our new heroes, even when they are forging new ways of working and doing things differently. This ancestor worship sin makes us look back too much and not forward. It encourages the preserving state of mind, which can, to my mind, be anti-developmental. The sixth is irrelevant and inaccessible. We seem to find it hard to adapt our methodology and our way of working for now, DIT being actually a very noble exception to that. Thank goodness for DIT. We have been slow to respond to the operating environment. We don't do horizon scanning and think, ooh, what can we develop in response to need that will bring us a new set of opportunities? Or think, what have we got that we can adapt to meet what is needed now? There are time-honoured ways of working that I hope will continue, but 5 times a week on the couch isn't going to keep us relevant in a wider sense. And the final one is splitting and factionalism. And that's just we don't work enough with others. And even among ourselves, we've spent just too much time on small differences. From the hostilities between Jung and Freud to the controversial discussions to the split between UKCP and BPC, we have been squandering our resources and energies. And we're doing it now. There's still new splits going on, and it's such a shame. Better together is something we don't just seem to have in our marrow. But unless we join up, we're frankly screwed. So, the answer is 7 lively virtues. Recognise and value the importance of leadership. You know, we really need to learn to follow and not keep kind of niggling and questioning and undermining people who are trying to do things. Even if they do them sometimes in a clumsy way or slightly piss us off, we should support people on the whole. We need to get out more. That means really get out more. You know, go and talk to all sorts of people, find out things. We need to renew the sense of psychoanalytic therapy as having a role in social justice. And of course, Malcolm pointed to that. But it's absolutely critical. We will not bring people along with us unless we are talking about, you know, making a real difference to the things that, you know, that we were just, Isabel was just talking about. Those things really, really do matter. And they also can galvanise a profession and a group to engage with something. We need to stop dissipating our power and work with others. We haven't got enough resources. It's absolutely ridiculous that there are, you know, a million little organisations. APP, your website's rubbish. BPC's website's rubbish. We need one good website. We need to gather our resources together. We need to actually merge. We just need to merge lots of organisations. Now, the thing that I've become chair of BPC about is to do that with the wider counselling and psychotherapy profession. We need to build, I hope, a Royal College of Counsellors and Psychotherapists. I do think it's terrible that the psychologists are going to lose their funding, along with child psychotherapists, or potentially. But goodness me, we need counsellors and psychotherapists to be lobbying for funding for them. You know, the psychology profession has stolen a march on us, and that is a real problem for the development of services that have a kind of real richness and ability to respond to need. So I hope we will build a partnership. We are building a partnership with the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy and the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy and BPC to actually bring about Royal College and to develop a psychoanalytic section within that, which I hope will bring together some of the splits that have really not been helpful. I mean, if we did that, we would go, I guess, we've got 2,000 child psychoanalytic psychotherapists. We've got about 2,500 to maybe 3,000 psychoanalytic and psychodynamic people within UKCP. We've got 3,000 in BPC. We've got all the psychodynamic counsellors in BACP. Think how big a group we would be. We would be a bigger group, probably, than any other group. We're bigger than the psychologists, we'd be bigger than the integrative people, the humanistic people. Think about that in terms of our muscle, in terms of getting into doors. The moment we don't use that potential, you know, it's a leverage issue. So, the 5th, again, we really need to review how we train and what we teach. We need to teach people to be critical of the theories they're hearing. And we need to teach people about neuroscience, attachment theory. We need people to be engaged with these new developments. And we need to deliver the teaching and the training in a way that allows for diversity and access into our profession that people currently don't have. And that's my last one. We must diversify our profession so we represent the communities we serve. And the last one, which is research, research, research. We have to keep researching. We're nothing if we don't actually research. well, we could do this or we could do not, and if we don't, well, we could donate our organs. We could die and donate our organs. We already have donated a lot of our organs, because if you look at, psychological therapies generally, I was watching, I don't know if anybody has seen Sex on the Couch. I have a son who works in television who made me watch Sex on the Couch, which is ghastly. Anyway, of course it's reaching out, and lots of people are, I've got patients who are watching it, and but what was interesting about it is that one of the people who are kind of a TV therapist is a clinical psychologist, but describes herself as a psychodynamic therapist, and I looked closely at what she'd done. And she's done a kind of couple of short courses. She hasn't done DIP, by the way, but she's done a short course on psychodynamic therapy. So she's gutted. She's taken a little bit of us, she's taken off, as, all these professions are. We've donated a lot of organs. I think we should, try and hold on to them, gather ourselves together, be a body that can do something. Okay.
Thank you. So that's great. So do you want to sort of here now, initially PowerPoint, Isabel? So lots of challenges and some very interesting ideas for us to discuss. We've heard from two leaders, two chairs of our professional bodies, and I now want to turn to someone who I work with, in fact, who is on the front line, a practitioner who is working in deepest, darkest Brixton with the various sort of social issues and deprivation issues and difficult issues coming through the front door of IAPT services day in, day out, and having to manage the kinds of targets and the regime that IAPT has set up. So I'm delighted to introduce Diana Butler.
So Jeremy's invited me to talk about my experience as a counsellor in an IAPT service, and also previously my experience working in the GP surgery, and how the IAPT services are managed in different areas are very different. So I don't assume to talk about them in general. There's lots of room for creativity amongst the constraints, but one point that I will make is that a kind of a very narrowly defined results-driven culture penalises those services that actually work with the most complex clients. So starting off with talking about working in a GP surgery and practice-based counselling, which was a bit like a cottage industry, very hands-on, labour-intensive, limited technology, I guess you could say. Very collaborative with the GPs and rooted in communities and within the catchment, which enabled us to develop a really detailed knowledge of the local areas and the issues that people were facing. And within fairly short counselling contracts, we were able to support people sort of long term. Most of the counsellors actually, staff turnover was incredibly low, so people were often in their surgeries for a very long time, as I was. And clearly people found that very rewarding to be based in the community and to be able to see people. But the context was, the incredible pressure on GPs with massive queues, difficulties getting appointments, that the GPs were based in areas with lots of social need, and all which had to be managed, and all of the physical and mental health issues that arose out of that, and all of which had to be managed within a 7-minute consultation. So many GPs saw the practice-based counsellor as vital to their survival, and in fact one actually said to me that if she didn't have a counsellor she would have to give up being a GP, so that's how much they felt the need of the service. So as counsellors we really capitalised on the nexus of relationships. You know, where I was working, the GPs had been a team there since they'd qualified together, so something like 20, 30 years, and they had a real commitment to the community. And so there was a lot of trust with their patients in them, and so that trust, if they recommended counselling to people who might otherwise be sceptical or ambivalent, that they might actually come along. And it was then up to me to convert that trust into a meaningful encounter so that they actually felt it was worthwhile. And so that in that way we actually managed to, we had clients who might otherwise not have access to counselling. So because of that, those kind of relationships, we were more likely to hold on to clients rather than refer them on. So we didn't. So some of the clients that IAPT services now would think not suitable, we didn't. We would try and work with people if we could. So some of the difficulties of that model was that it depended on the clinical skills and awarenesses of the GP, which in the surgeries I worked was very good. But I've also worked, for example, on the Isle of Sheppey, where despite incredible social deprivation, I didn't even have a waiting list. In fact, I struggled to fill the few spots that I had. So that was one of the problems with that model. The counsellors were also incredibly isolated from the trends and wider thinking about service provision, and also therefore didn't develop the skills, and their perspective didn't feed into, you know, the more local thoughts about how to deliver a good service, because we just weren't involved. So it was a bit of a career cul-de-sac. And there was insufficient exchange with colleagues, you know, in multidisciplinary teams, and we tended to think in slightly stereotypically ways of other kinds of therapy. But on the whole, it was actually cost effective, and probably people here don't need to be convinced that counselling in its different forms was as effective for depression as CBT, even though it's not recognised in the NICE guidelines. So then the practice-based counsellors joined the greater IAPT team in what was more of an industrial model. So then the work experience was very different. All of a sudden I was involved in a very wide range of activities by a team with varied skills and specialist knowledge. There were all kinds of things that we provided and do provide. Also that there's a constant review of our practices and procedures that at times is quite difficult to keep up with, but there's a constant revising, looking at feedback. We have a service user forum, and also engage in the NHS quality improvement programme. So with this kind of information explosion, but also kind of connecting with the wider community and needing to know what was being provided in the third sector, knowing all sorts of things, even keeping up to date with the NHS services is quite difficult. And can see that actually it takes a whole team to keep on top of that sort of information and keep up to date with it. But the counsellors were a minority in an established CBT culture, and so not necessarily involved in deciding or determining how services developed. But there are many kinds of, activities that we do, things like guided study. Mostly it's CBT-based, online CBT, run workshops, long-term health conditions, and I've seen how, you know, many clients really benefit from these activities, like people with long-term health conditions saying that the group was a sanctuary, or the bereavement group, and I rang up offering somebody individual counselling, and they said actually they'd got so much from the group that they didn't feel the need for counselling anymore. So clearly many of these interventions are very valued. There's also, we do a lot of signposting, we have somebody who works in the community, and there's also a team that deals with employment, volunteering, training, education. So in other words, a need to engage with these wider social issues is actually essential to providing a good psychological therapy service. So I also trained in DIT, and so that's been my little haven of psychodynamic thinking, which is very different from the rest of the service, and it feels like a great luxury, the supervision and the time to think psychoanalytically about the work and actually have that space for reflection. And I thought the gateway into the service is through the screening call, and I thought I'd just give you a little description of what it's like. So you'll have a room with one therapist, maybe several, with a headset and a screen, and you've got 45 minutes to screen people, full of completing the questionnaires, monitoring the confidentiality, the data, permissions, and then clicking into therapeutic mode to take a full case history and work out what next. So as you can imagine, somebody presenting with a discrete issue that they managed to describe succinctly is the ideal kind of person. But people presenting with complex, overwhelming need, a great need to talk to somebody, maybe never talked to anybody before, substance misuse issues, multiple traumas, housing and benefits issues, it can be really overwhelming. And I've often been around my colleagues in the same room who've just come off of their second screening call, kind of reeling from the trauma that they've had to listen to. In fact, I felt the same myself. So that kind of sense of being on the brink of being overwhelmed is always part of it, in the sense that you're doing and having to do a lot with a very little at all times, and it's threatening to capsize. And obviously, the IAPT service doesn't work in a vacuum. It's where, at a time of austerity and everything else being squeezed, and the secondary service is not really there. We don't have any psychiatric input. The service is not supposed to be provided for people, for example, with personality disorder, but so few people are actually diagnosed that we do. So the level of complexity and severity of the issues that we work with are probably much greater than was originally intended. And so that's just a picture of what it's like. So thinking about future, once again, despite this constant threat of being overwhelmed, accessibility has got to be the issue, and which is going to have to mean more resources. Again, yes, diversity of therapists, developing specialists whose specialist knowledge is valued and used, as for example the models of the Waterloo Multi-Ethnic Counselling Service and NAFSI Intercultural Therapy Service, who both work with IAPT service users. And also the awareness that there's a social justice emergency, and it's really affecting the work that we do and the work that we need to do. It's sending more and more clients our way with greater levels of distress and helplessness, and that it's really important that when we're devising structures that we do that as imaginatively as possible, so that we don't kind of parallel the traumatizing processes that are there already in the benefit system and so much else.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that really valuable insight into IAPT, and as much as we need to make sure that we continue to engage with NICE over the next 10 years, IAPT is it in terms of talking therapies on the NHS, so unless we find a way to engage more effectively with IAPT over the next 10 years, we won't have succeeded. So our last speaker then could be described, I think, either as a poacher turned gamekeeper, or gamekeeper turned poacher, depending on where you sort of frame the issue. But I knew Paul originally when you were chief executive of Rethink, which is the national charity for schizophrenia, and as one of a group of mental health charities that were part of the We Need to Talk coalition, that I looked on as an incredibly effective, coordinated campaigning group that spoke with one voice and spoke on behalf of patients and really got things to happen, and had nothing to do with the professional bodies at all. You could not get in the same room even to talk to each other, let alone to speak with one voice about things 10 years or so ago. Although I had a try to the use of one partnership, bringing together, really with the help of the mental health charities, trying to knock some sense into the professional bodies and get them to function more effectively than they had done. So I'm delighted to introduce Paul now in his role as Chief Executive of the Test.
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and thanks for organising tonight's meeting. A very warm welcome to everybody to the Tavistock tonight. I think that this is a really important and timely discussion and great significance to our organisation as obviously one of the largest provider of psychodynamic interventions in the UK. And it does seem to be a sad irony that at a time when mental health more widely is definitely in an ascendancy, we should be having a debate about a threat to an important part of the armoury of what we can offer to patients experiencing more complex and challenging needs. So why is that? I hope as somebody, as Jeremy described, has both led this organisation for 5 years, but has also campaigned more widely on mental health issues, I might offer some reflections. Some of what I'm going to be saying, I think I already know, chimes with what others have already said tonight, and I think that's no bad thing. The first point I want to make is stating the obvious. There are many more people, adults and young people, who could benefit from psychoanalytically informed psychotherapy than currently have the chance to do so. That is a function of policy, it's a function of funding, but actually also perhaps of our inability to make a convincing case for what long-term therapy has to offer. So I think all of us are indulging in lists. So I've got a list of 5 things we need to do to address and change this. The first is to be better at communication. To the layperson, psychoanalysis is both a familiar concept, but also one which in reality can be tremendously remote. Few people outside the profession know much about what goes on in the consulting room. We have not made enough effort to promote and explain our work in ways which are accessible to a wider audience. We have allowed ourselves to be stereotyped as old-fashioned and elitist. There is a big need to do better and to tell the human stories, both of clinicians and service users and families, which sit behind the disciplines and modalities we represent. We need to harness the power of psychoanalytical and systemic thinking, provide understanding of some of the wider social problems which most distress society today. This is something I've certainly tried to get our organisation to give focus to, for instance, in letting television cameras in to follow aspects, part of our work with young people, and I also applaud the work of the ACP in trying to raise the profile of child psychotherapy, highlighting the benefits of some of the most distressed young people. The second imperative, as lots of us have been saying already, is to work together. From the outside, the world of psychotherapy can look incredibly disjointed and at times divided. The same used to be true of the wider mental health world. And it's no secret that in the years before Times Change, my old organisation, Rethink Mental Illness, and mine, its most significant potential partner, were scarcely on speaking terms. It is part of the success in recent years of the mental health lobby that it has found ways of working together and presenting a common voice on key issues to government and other decision makers. As champions of psychotherapy, we have started to make moves in the right direction, in particular working together into challenging the narrowness of the draft NICE guidelines on depression. Felicitas Rost, President of the Society for Psychotherapy Research, deserves an awful lot of credit for her leadership on this issue. NICE is doing further thinking, and in the meantime, the sector is coming together and finding allies in the political and wider spheres. Building on this, I would very much welcome working with the APP, BPC and others to establish much more of a wider common agenda for the future of long-term therapies within the NHS. The third challenge is around research and evidence. Psychoanalysis prides itself in its own traditions around the development and sharing of knowledge. Those traditions are perfectly valid, but the result has been that it has been disadvantaged compared to other traditions such as CBT in being able to demonstrate the outcomes, including the economic benefit of interventions. RCTs may not be the holy grail that they are sometimes set out to be, but there is a real danger that without comparable evidence, long-term psychotherapy will be squeezed out in the competition for resources. The Tavistock Adult Depression Study, which others have already alluded to, was a major milestone in attempts to address this, but there is a need to do a lot more. My fourth point is to be better at focusing our arguments on the why and not the what. By this I mean channeling our arguments not on the preservation of particular approaches and modalities for their own sake, but rather on the key difference they can make uniquely, or just as importantly in tandem with other approaches, to addressing intractable individual or systemic problems. Successful innovations that we've taken forward in this trust, such as the Family Drug and Alcohol Course, FDAC, which includes psychotherapeutic and systemic approaches, have achieved profile by being able to demonstrate effectiveness in addressing the human tragedy of parents losing their children due to unmanageable drug or alcohol misuse issues. In many cases seen by FDAC, those seemingly intractable situations are the result of intergenerational trauma and can often only be overcome by a painful exploration and a making sense of those issues. There are many other issues where a similar approach could be taken, school exclusion and knife crime, to name two that are currently in the media. Linked to this, and as a final point, is the need for us to be able to innovate and adapt to meet different opportunities. This may relate to how and where therapy is delivered. It may relate to how we make approaches more accessible to different groups. It may also relate on occasions to the duration of treatment offered. Our primary care psychotherapy service, which operates both in Hackney and in Camden, has been a successful example of where we've been able to adapt traditional models of intervention to focus on the specific needs of patients presenting in primary care with medically unexplained symptoms. I can appreciate that there are some who will be suspicious of attempts, as they might see it, to dilute or dumb down traditional approaches. There must be boundaries, but change is also necessary if the traditions we value are to survive and be relevant to the modern world. As Gustav Mahler said of music, tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. Crucially, this is also necessary in the interest of fairness. If therapies are to continue to be accessed through the NHS, we must seek to make them more widely available than they currently are. As the largest provider of training in this area, I'm acutely aware that our work is also to ensure a wider spread of qualified clinicians in some of those areas where there is the greatest need, as the recent study conducted by The Guardian pointed out. So I think there is much to campaign for over the next 10 years. There are plans to expand mental health services and to address the treatment gap for those in mental distress. To do so, despite what it says in the long-term plan, there is a need for a range of approaches, including longer-term psychoanalytic-informed treatments, which can be effective in supporting those with some of the most complex and enduring difficulties, and which also offer powerful insights in how we support the well-being of the NHS workforce itself. However, to make our argument for investment, we will need to work in different ways, facing outward and evidencing not just our right to exist, but the contribution we can make to addressing need and solving wider issues facing society. In doing so, we will need, as other groups have succeeded in doing, to narrow internal differences and broaden the common shared ground on which we can make our case. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Paul. We've had a rich menu of lists, and amongst them some common themes which would suggest that we ought to be able to do this. Certainly the common theme of working together came through across everybody, so it should be possible then to do this. And and certainly from one person here who has a budget of several tens of £1 million, I heard a clear commitment to work together with the APP and the UPC and the ACP. So we shall definitely follow up on that. We have, I think, probably 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask the panel to just kind of note any questions, but really I'm inviting contributions to have a conversation, then including yourselves, and then I'll come back to the panel just at the end for some final responses from each people. We have a roving mic and a roving chair. If I can get it to work. So who would like to start us off? Great. I think if I just hold that down for a minute.
I can talk loudly.
Okay, we can start. Have you got?
Talk loudly.
Okay. I just want to thank you all, four of you. I thought they were all very good presentations, and I like the common themes that were there. Oh, there you go, it's working. I just want to say, as someone who's done quite a lot of lobbying with politicians on behalf of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, mainly around children and young people, what politicians want to hear is a united message from disparate professions, and the best way of shooting ourselves in the foot is to argue amongst ourselves between psychiatrists, psychotherapists, psychologists, etc., etc. When you're trying to influence things on a national level, you have to come together and give a common message. And I've sat in quite a few meetings where that has worked well, and others where it hasn't worked well. And I just wanted to echo really what you were saying, and just say they need to hear fairly simple, clear messages. And when lots of bodies are coming together and saying the same kind of thing, they really listen. And when they hear different bodies saying different things, they switch off. So I just wanted to really echo what you said.
Do you want to just tell us who you are?
My name is John Golden. I'm Vice Chair of the Child Psychiatry Faculty at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I'm a child psychiatrist.
Thank you. Thanks very much, John. Who else? Great.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Hi, I'm Mike Owen. I'm Interim CEO of the BPF. First of all, can I just congratulate everyone on superb set of presentations. Brilliant job, Jeremy, organising tonight. I just wanted to say two things. I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not intelligent enough for that, but I'm an outsider, and I just wanted to congratulate everyone on being so honest. It's the first time I've been in the sector for 11 months. And I've always felt as if I was insane or not part of the local human race in the sector by saying things like, why are people expected to attend 4 or 5 sessions a week? So it's great that we've got this awareness within the profession, and it just needs pulling together, doesn't it? And if the BPF can help working in other organisations, we'd love to do that. I just wanted to add 3 points on a quick list, because I read other things in other professions, and I was surprised that part of the list that was suggested didn't include 3 particular things: use of technology, more self-help, and having more hybrid professional health workers. Using technology, things like apps to empower individual patients. That is a key thing, I think, for the future. But also self-help. I used to work in the pharmaceutical sector, but more across the world, people can't afford expensive healthcare professionals. So they're trying to go away from the health professional knows best and trying to empower individuals, and don't expect people to go to a session to be helped. Try and help the individual. And the third one was trying to have more hybrid professionals, or a lower, perhaps almost like a therapist, but without such high intensity of training. It's almost like a paralegal as opposed to a solicitor. Can there be less intensive training and lighter degrees of professional healthcare education to marry needs that are less intensive or less critical? Can we have lower levels of training to meet at more a counselling level of health worker, rather than people being trained for 7 years or whatever, we need more resource, and that means perhaps being less long-winded in terms of training people. Does that make sense?
It certainly makes sense from someone with a fresh pair of eyes, Mike. So very, very welcome contribution. Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, I'd like to echo the previous two people to say what a stimulating set of talks that was. So thank you. My name is Ben Robinson. I'm an ST, means a higher trainee in general adult psychiatry at the Maudsley, and also I finished my medical psychotherapy training, so I'm dual training in those two things. My question is, I also work in Brixton, so shout out to Brixton. My question is, for talking to policymakers and politicians and people who are not part of our profession, how much do you think they need to understand what we understand as special about psychodynamic therapy and all the things we value about that? Because, you know, as someone in the early stages of their career, it still strikes me as amazing, some of the insights and the things that characterize psychotherapy. And if I was I think I've said enough. That's my question.
Great question. So I've got 1, 2, and then 3 over here, and then Felicitas as well. So we have a politicians' mindfulness group, and I think the question is, should we have a psychoanalysts group?
Thanks, Jeremy. My name's Lucy Marks. I'm a clinical psychologist. I used to run primary care, psychology and counselling services for some time in Tower Hamlets. And we were also part of the development of DIT. And I'm obviously very much in favour of bringing people together and having one voice and deciding what the messages are and going in very hard with them. I was just thinking about what campaign had been successful over the last few years in terms of turning things around in terms of mental health. And I think the lobbying groups that really came from service users about the gaps in perinatal mental health were very successful. The problem is, however, that all the money has gone into CMHT level work, and there's a gap. But I was thinking that one thing that we haven't talked about this evening is the power of hearing from service users, local people, communities about what they think is missing. But more than that, trying to gather the evidence, because obviously we're aware that IAPT is king, but we know that there's a gap, so that there's a gap between IAPT and then psychiatric services, and that really is the place of psychoanalytically informed psychotherapy, as well as obviously DIT needing to have much more of a profile in IAPT. I imagine that actually DIT is dwindling, DIT therapists are dwindling in IAPT at the moment. So I also think that we just need to be thinking about what are we really aiming for. So if we all come together, what are we trying to do? And decide what our messages are. But I would say that we also really need to focus on the gap and do some research that involves service users' experience, so that we've got strong evidence too about the way in which we could be making more of a difference.
Thank you very much, Lucy. It's probably a little known fact, but 2 of the most powerful people in the world of mental health, Lord Victor Adeboali and Jackie Dillon, 2 great advocates for BME groups and access, but also in key influential positions in NHS England, have both experienced and benefited from psychoanalytic psychotherapy and are great advocates of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and we have never used them in that respect.
Thank you. I'm Ronnie Doctor. I was a previous chair of the APP, so I thought I'd just... this is a question to Suzanne. You just gave us a list of 7 sins one of which was insularity, uncertainty. I'll just concentrate on those two, which I would think are not sins, but sort of virtues in terms of practice, practicing psychoanalytic psychotherapy. But when you go to the outside, psychotherapists take their role as psychotherapists and think they have to therapize the government. You see, they can't leave their role as psychotherapists in the consulting room and be insular and uncertain, but they take all those qualities and think they can speak to the government. So maybe what we need is to employ a marketing agency to go and talk to the government, whoever else they want to talk to, and market with certainty and outwardness the virtues of psychotherapy.
Thank you. PR, brand issues there. So I've got one here, and then Felicitas and then
My name is Janet Kaplan. I'm a psychodynamic counsellor at an IAPT service. 2 points. Apropos of the gentleman's comments over there. I'm always struck by, currently in the current climate, when we're talking about Brexit, we talked about this evening, but we're talking about Brexit and the kind of split. And I'm always thinking, if you had a marketeer out there, he or she could go out there and actually explain to the layperson about the kind of, one of the reasons the country's struggling with this divorce for the last 3 years is because we're struggling with anxieties, that we're not being able to manage, so to speak, the kind of depressive position, but using a more layperson's terms. And I think that'd be a fantastic way of actually speaking to the general public about splitting in a very kind of practical way. The other point was apropos IAPT service. I don't know if this is feasible and that people are already doing it, but from my experience in the IAPT service, and I'm a psychodynamic counsellor and we're quite strong in psychodynamic where I am, we see so many episodes of patients who come through CBT and have lots of episodes with CBT, and then they come and see us. But I wouldn't say they're good enough. They're certainly good enough. And I'm wondering if there's any research on the kind of episodes, the number of episodes in IAPT services that are treated CBT-wise and then counselling, certainly from a psychodynamic perspective, which is very powerful.
Thank you. So a couple of 3 final comments then, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. It was very stimulating and thought-provoking. I mean, I guess I just wanted to really, well, what you all have sort of mentioned, the R word, you know, which is often the R word sort of holding really, you know, especially within psychoanalytic thinking, research and how important it is. And I guess that's what I want to stress. On one hand, you know, to campaign and coming together, and, you know, coming all together in order to campaign is important, but you need something for that. And I think, you know, the word hard data, soft data, whatever you want to use, is really needed for that. But within that, I think it is also to think, for us to think about what is research. And we have certain, well, we have, you know, research isn't just, you know, as Paul said, RCTs, but research is case studies. Research is all kinds of modalities that we have on display. And I think it is both within the profession to kind of stress and to show that we can use the various research modalities, and that we, you know, I suppose we're making arguments against RCTs, or arguments against studies. And what I wanted to say is that by doing that, we keep a sort of arbitrary distinction between research methodologies. And I think we don't have to do that. I think we can engage in both, or in all kinds of methodologies. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think it is really important to do research. And for that, coming back to the point you've also raised, to kind of come together, what we do need is funding. Research needs funding. And I suppose, in thinking about collaboration, how can we all come together in order to, you know, to fund research, which is actually really needed. And one of the issues with NICE really is what's not mentioned in NICE also does not get funded. So we do have to rely on our own funding, and I wonder whether we can think about that too. How can we fund more research in psychoanalytic practice?
Thank you for this. Robin.
Hi, Robin Solid, and I was a consultant social worker here at Tavistock. And I was very interested in, well, in thanking people for their contribution, but very interested in the amount of times people talked about austerity and social problems, and yet nothing was ever said about social work. And I think what's been very interesting to me and important for us to think about is the problem about pathologizing social problems, that there is somewhere where these ideas have to be integrated as well as separate. And that I think that you have a workforce, I know there's social training here at Tavistock and so forth, but you do have a workforce with many people who are very open to this way of thinking, not necessarily to be social workers and get their clients on the couch, but actually how important it is to have social workers informed with this way of thinking. They deal with the most extraordinary projections from people they don't know what to do with. And I was thinking how the IAPT, when you said, I started my career 40 years ago in Brixton in a social work team where social workers were placed in every GP surgery. Okay, that's what we did. And that we dealt with, as well as counselling, we dealt with housing and health, the benefits, all sorts of things, and they were combined way of thinking. And I guess what I'd like to help to say, I think social care has been separated from health, and if we want these ideas to really have a voice, then I think we have to realign ourselves with social care.
Thank you very much. So final contribution.
Hi, my name is Hope Simon. I work in a CMHT in Hertfordshire, and I wanted to ask really how we get, I know people are talking about IAPT, I want to focus on how we get psychotherapy into secondary mental health care. So I work in a trust where we do that, and we're very, very valued. We see all the most difficult patients. My psychology colleagues value us enormously. However, when there are very, very few of us, we do have some posts. It's very difficult to fill those posts. We find it very difficult to recruit people who have got good experience, who've got experience of working in the NHS with a complex and severe range of problems. At the same time, I think that there is an opportunity because there is a recruitment problem in terms of the other professions. Psychology generally we can recruit, social work can't recruit, nursing it's a real struggle. And I was interested in what you said about hybrid professions, because I think what's happening in the NHS in secondary care is that there's a response to the recruitment problem. We're making professions up. And I wonder if there is a bit of space actually to try and do that a bit more creatively. So I suppose my question is, how can we do that? How can we not only work in IAPT, but also recognise that I think we're very valued in secondary care services, but we're going to need to be a bit creative and a bit rough around the edges possibly to get more people in.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Hope, for returning us to the workforce issue to finish with. So I'd like then just to, perhaps starting with Paul, to go through to ask the panel to offer a final response, picking up any of the questions and anything you're going to take away from this evening's discussion yourself. So Paul.
Thanks very much, and thank you for some really rich questions and points during the discussion. So I'm going to talk about three things very quickly. First of all, I do really think we have a duty and an opportunity to publicise what we do more effectively. I think your point about if you've got somebody smart who's been able to talk about what's going on about Brexit, there would have been such an obvious audience for that. I think it's also about us being able to be a little breaking some of our to-dos about opening up the consulting room. You don't necessarily want fly on the wall, but there are things about people being able to see inside what that intervention is about, and hearing also from people with lived experience who've been on the receiving end of receiving those interventions. I think you raised some really interesting points about our challenges around scaling. IAPT works for all sorts of reasons, but one of its intervention, one of the things it did to be successful, is come up with a model of how to deliver at scale through the stepped care model and through an organised, as you say, more industrial model of delivery. I think for psychoanalytic or psychotherapy, I think there's some real challenges. Is it about different workforce groups? Is it about technology? Is it about spreading our expertise round other services rather than necessarily being a service in that? I think we need to have some debates about how to do that and best build on the best of current innovation. But there's an issue about where do we target. I think the gap between IAPT and secondary services is definitely one of them. I think what you said, Isabel, about early intervention prevention is a really, how do we stop the demand of the future, as well as how do we deal with demand of the present past. And then I think also there's opportunities around more systemic problems, things like knife crime, things like school exclusion. How can you find a more integrated response to those issues that involves the insights and perhaps also delivery of psychotherapeutic and systemic thinking. And I will, before Jeremy says it again, we're definitely up for being part of a coalition to try and work together on these issues.
Thank you, Paul. Isabel?
I think it would be good if we could think together about the workforce and the service models. And in answer to your question about the future of our training, is in a way it depends on the NHS being convinced that we are part of the service models of the future. So we're having to make the case that we are part of the service models of the future. And that involves engaging with all these questions about hybrids, this and all the rest of it. And how are we relevant to services in schools and all these things. But just going back to what you were saying about secondary services, I think I'm talking about adult services, but it's the same in children's services. There are posts in specialist services, and they are hard to fill, and there are reasons for that. And we need to think about why the services are so difficult to work in. And we could think very creatively together, I think, about that. And I think there were so many things were said. There's something important, just going back to why do we need to hold on to 4 times a week. It's difficult to face in so many directions at once as a profession. To be thinking, how are we relevant to this agenda and that agenda and that agenda, and at the same time still hold on to our roots, that we are trained to work in a consulting room, in privacy, without cameras, and that there is something unique and valuable about that. And then we have to think, well, how can we tell the story that means something to the policymakers and our colleagues in other professions? And we have been trying over the last year to work out how to do that in the ATP, and it's not easy. And it's not easy to get service users, actually. There are all sorts of ethical questions about getting your patients or your ex-patients or their parents involved in talking about their experience. But we have to find ways to tell stories, because I think we have to bring it to life, what we can offer.
Thank you, Isabel. Suzanne?
Okay, I agree with Isabel about facing in too many directions. I was thinking about pandas. And isn't there this thing about pandas that there's only 4 of them, and they're wandering around in the jungle, and they might meet up and they occasionally have a baby, and so that there's a thing, isn't there, about sort of needing critical mass in order to do all these things. So my feeling is that we have to be very focused. And while I started to write down lots and lots of things, and then I thought, no, we cannot do all of these things. We simply haven't got the resources or the people. We have to rebuild. We're actually going to have to rebuild our profession and our methodology almost from scratch. There's that organisational thing, that chart, about growth, and then you reach the top, and then you start to slide down, and if you slide down too far, you can't recover, because you haven't got the resources that you need to invest in the recovery, and we're pretty much there. So I think that we have to, in terms of the NHS, I don't think we should be doing apps or any of this. Too many people in that space. We need to be in the space which is doing the work that other professionals who have the robustness and the training that enables them to cope with the serious demands of those kinds of roles. The next step is to then disseminate back down to the core professions of social work, nursing, etc., etc. Can't start there right now.
Thank you. New ways of working for psychoanalytic psychotherapists. Diana, final reflections.
Just a few things. This has been such a fruitful conversation with so many really relevant and important ideas which make such a huge difference. So there's a real question about how this thinking can actually move forward and how more people can be involved, because it really combats the sense of helplessness that many people involved in the work end up feeling.
Thank you very much. So we need to finish. I'll just make one response to John's question. How important is it to persuade politicians of the unique value of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy? I've only tried it once with the Minister for Welfare Reform. It had a dramatic impact. But fortunately his name was Lord David Freud, who was the great-grandson of Sigmund, so he knew what I was talking about already. So if we can get more of the likes of David Freud to pick up and lobby for us, I think that we probably need to start with the ones who are already a bit on our side. So thank you very much for coming this evening. We're very keen to involve people in the work of the APP and in collaborative work with other organisations, so please do stay involved and get our newsletter and things like that. And thank you finally then to a wonderful panel of speakers for this evening.